Hey everybody, I want to talk about a product and platform that I absolutely love and our latest sponsor, Interseller, the prospecting and outreach platform of choice for recruiters and sellers. Whether you're doubling down on business development or recruiting talent, Interseller does all the heavy lifting of finding contact data, automating the email and follow-up process, and syncs all that rich data into 20 plus CRM and ATS platforms. Reach out now and get going on a 2-week free trial and let them know you heard about it from Adam on the podcast today. Check out the link on the website. Appreciate it.
Welcome to the podcast, where we introduce you to incredible humans who share their journeys with the mission to inspire you to harness your own inner tenacity to drive your life and career forward. And now, your host, Adam Posner.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast where I bring the best and brightest from the world of business, marketing, and personal growth to help you harness your inner tenacity and drive your career forward. My guest today, Matt Higgins, is an operator, investor, and overall business builder, not to mention reality TV star and co-shark on ABC's Shark Tank. Matt has worked with some of the top names in business, entertainment, sports, and even politics. And he started his career at 16 after dropping out of high school and grinding until he was personally selected by Rudy Giuliani to become the youngest press secretary in the history of New York City. And not long after, the tragic events of 9/11 unraveled and Higgins was thrust into the position of coordinating the global press response in the coming months. Since then, Matt has worked on the reconstruction efforts at the World Trade Center, the Memorial, held executive seats with the New York Jets and currently with the Miami Dolphins, founded RSE Ventures investment firm, and partnered with Gary Vaynerchuk on the Vayner Media Empire. And Matt has spanned an incredible spread of different careers and has seen immense success as well as tribulations throughout his life. I'm excited to unpack his career and set the stage for him to share his wisdom. Folks, without further ado, Matt Higgins. Matt Higgins, welcome to the podcast, my man. Thank you so much for making the time to join me today.
All right, thank you for having me. All right,
awesome.
Fellow Long Island. I could say I'm from Long Island too, because Queens is technically on Long Island.
It's connected. It's part of the same island.
It is. Although we, growing up in Queens, we would resent Long Island. Like that was how the other half lived. So just full disclosure. But
I felt it, man. Hey, listen, I moved from Brooklyn to Long Island, and I felt it right away. And I was like, oh, who's this kid coming in the middle of 7th grade from Brooklyn? He must be tough. And I'm like, hey, I'm just a little Jewish kid from Brooklyn. Like I'm not the tough guy. So let's jump in here. We're recording the show on the 10th day of November. It was an absolutely insane weekend for many different reasons. First of all, it was like 75 degrees. I don't know about you. I felt a weight lifted off my chest this weekend. I felt like it was just a breath of fresh air. And I typically start every show talking about my guest's past. We talk about the origin story, but let's talk about the 2020 election for a moment, if you don't mind. And in 2016, you came out and you endorsed, and you're a Republican, correct me if I'm wrong, and you endorsed Clinton. And it didn't even matter about taxation because it was really important was preserving the republic. And I believe you had a similar position this time around. As much as you'd like to share, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what transpired in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's amazing that you dug that up, actually, because I was looking for context for everybody listening in the last election, and I was listening to the heated rhetoric from Trump and just him that time when he mocked the reporter with a disability and what he was talking about, that judge, of Mexican descent. And I remember I had grown up, sort of come of age in the Republican Party. I had worked with Mitt Romney and John McCain, and early days, I was Giuliani's press secretary, a different era, full disclosure.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. But I was listening to this rhetoric and thinking, like, there's no way I can justify this to my son. And by being a member of the party, I'm effectively endorsing it. I don't stand it. And what I thought was dangerous at the time, you would hear a lot of people, supposedly experts, saying, it doesn't matter. He's not going to win. Like, he's a clown, whatever. And I'm like, that's always the most dangerous place to be, where people are motivated by the idea that, well, that person's not going to get elected, but they don't really particularly support Hillary Clinton either. And I thought it was incumbent upon me to set an example to actually get involved, put myself in harm's way. So I walked into the campaign headquarters in Brooklyn and said, I'm here. I want to help Hillary Clinton get elected. Principally motivated by Donald Trump not getting elected, but also I think she'd do a fine job. And I went out there and did a bunch of interviews where I kept saying over and over again, sometimes we all have a hierarchy of ideology, right? Where some things matter more to us. And for me, I said the preservation of the Republic of the United States is way more important than taxation or anything else. And I remember some said, geez, very loaded land, preservation of the Republic. you really think that's at stake? And I said, I 100% think that's at stake, because throughout history, people who behave inappropriately or break a seal on societal norms, they always tell you in advance what they plan to do. Nothing that's happened in the last
telegraph it
has been a surprise unless you decide to put your head in the sand. And so I don't know. I got involved.
I hear you, man. And I was talking to my wife the other day, and we had this conversation in the car. Trump is the most authentic politician we've ever had. He is what you get. What you see is what you get. Like, there's no faking it. There's no, career politician there. He says it. He means it. He does it. And like, you got to give the guy a little bit of credit when it comes down to the authenticity, whether you love it or not.
I'm a student of political science, whatever. You look throughout history, any kind of demagogue will always forecast exactly what they plan to do. So nothing he did was a surprise. You have to give him some credit for being, consistent. so anyway, I just felt very passionate that I need to model out to my kids and to myself. So throughout, for time immemorial, I would know that I stood up and spoke out. So like you, I have a great weight off my shoulders, and think this is a chance for a reset in America, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, and it's tough though. But I really and we forget too a lot. There's 77 million people voted for Biden. 70 million people voted for. There's still a lot of people that voted for Trump, and they're upset. They're sour too, and not all of them, but we the hard work is now. I mean, we're talking about
And I think we have to return to a place where you're allowed to have a difference of opinion. One of the problems where the pendulum switched too far in the other direction is that anybody who supported Donald Trump was completely shamed, and that's I was. Groupthink is terrific when you agree with the thing you're supposed to agree with, but when groupthink,
you're on the other side, man.
When you're on the other side and you have a fascist groupthink, or you're being ostracized because you're standing up for somebody's human rights or civil rights who's an ostracized group, then it's not so great anymore. So I'm always very nervous about being shamed into one viewpoint or another. So that being said, I think we need to respect the fact that 70 million people, for whatever reason, disagreed. But we need to cast a wider net somehow or other. I know at the moment that's just empty words. I know that, but because we need a period where we just need to chill the F out and take the temperature down. Maybe we could put politics off the front page for a bit, right?
Let's get back to COVID. Let's get back to this COVID thing, right? That we're back.
It's been kind of a traumatic period. Maybe we could just have a little bit of a break,
Yeah. I mean, there's bright news on the horizon. I mean, the perfectly timed Pfizer announcement, perfectly timed, they and
look, we have the first female vice president. It's an interesting how every crisis always births something amazing, right? And now we have Kamala, and we have a nice president. He's a nice guy. Whatever you think of Joe Biden, I mean, he seems like a fundamentally decent human being who's given a lot of himself to public service. So just cut him some slack, see how it goes.
Let's roll with it. So let's switch gears. Let's hit the rewind button here. And how I start off every show, I love to unpack.
One more point, since we're on the record now. One more point. I was very passionate about Mayor Pete. I got very involved with Mayor Pete. I maxed out on fundraising side. I went to a couple of events. So I think we'll be seeing Mayor Pete and however number of years, 8 or 12 or something like that.
Is he going to get a cabinet position?
I bet that he would get a cabinet position, maybe Veterans Affairs, or I'm sure he'd love the UN, because that's how you can go ahead and prove your your international chops, right? But one way or another, Mayor Pete is brilliant and fundamentally decent human being.
Oh, he's great.
I think so. I just want to be on the record, Adam. So when we kind of pull this up from the archives,
the time capsule, my friend. That's what I love about the show. It's a time capsule. So we're gonna hit the rewind button here, and let's bring everyone back. Let's bring everyone back to Bayside, Queens. And you've had an incredible transformation where you're able to manifest your dreams. Growing up, do I use the word poor? Single family household.
Dirt poor, I prefer. I mean,
dirt poor. Single parent household.
Also more accurate.
Bayside, Queens, all the way to the boardroom, and you've been everywhere in between. We'll dig into the career journey in a little bit. And it's been nothing but easy. And you talk a lot about, in the early days, your early family life primed you for a lot of these obstacles you were going to face later on. What were some of those challenges? And, looking back, what were some of those big lessons that you learned from the childhood?
Well, I think probably this is a little bit, abstract, but bear with me for a second. I think probably the most important lesson that I learned at the youngest age possible, at 16, was that you have to be really careful whose advice you take, because it's usually lacking in context, right? So what I mean in my situation, I was growing up relatively desperate. I had a mother who was increasingly disabled. I was sleeping on a floor on a mattress. No one had ever even come over to my house as a kid, for the most part. I lived in shame. And then, of course, as a kid, you're trying to cover that up. I was wearing at the time Guess jeans, whatever, anything to make myself not look poor while selling flowers and handbags on the street. And yet I had a vision when I was pretty young saying, okay, on the one hand, if I don't get out of poverty as fast as possible, my mother's going to deteriorate. And by the way, I hate this life and I'm very depressed and I could see myself being reckless at some point, right? Just self-destructive. On the other hand, there's a loophole where I could drop out of high school at age 16 and I can get my GED and I can get to college as fast as humanly possible. And once I'm in college, I can go from making $3.75 at McDonald's or $5 at a deli overnight on Queen Boulevard in Queens to making $9-10 an hour simply by enrolling in college. And I remember talking to the teachers and at Cardozo High School and my guidance counselor who all saw my potential and, intellect, whatever. You're going to be branded a loser forever. Like, you're going to throw your life away. I remember thinking, I could probably clean this up. If I have enough time, I could explain away this decision. But why would I sit here for the next several years and languish in these terrible circumstances? So around the age of, I guess it was around 14, I said, I really need to give myself no option but to make this dramatic move. So I got left back every year and stayed in the same class for 2.5 years, truants and kids with beepers and just getting left back. And because then it would give me no option but to burn the boats and go all in.
But let's talk about that decision to drop out of high school back then when it was incredibly more scrutinized.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, what was that decision like?
It was a hard decision because I saw an opening, right? Back up for a second. Like, most of the rules of life and conventional wisdom are designed and constructed for the average situation, right? So what's the average situation? Yeah, you have two parents or at least one functioning parent. You probably have enough to eat at night, right? Like, so that makes sense. Do 4 years of high school, apply. Yay, I got into SUNY Binghamton or wherever the hell you're going, right? They're not meant for a kid that at age 11 was basically socialized to be a parent, right? I was basically a parent. Sorry,
you had to take care of yourself.
I had to take care of myself. So, it's important. I say this to everybody. You have to assess the rules that govern you to decide, are those rules really meant to aid you or are they meant to inhibit your growth? Not that you need to be a rule breaker. You need to challenge conventional wisdom. So dropping out was the hardest thing I ever did, but actually the best decision I ever made because it accelerated my development by, so dramatically, right? I mean, by the time I was 19 years old, I was working at a newspaper writing investigative articles. By the time I was 20, I'd been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize by Carl Bernstein. Like, it accelerated my growth. I always say Warren Buffett talks about compounding, right? Compounding is one of the greatest ideas. Compounding implies to your professional success too. The sooner you start, the harder you hit it, the more years you have to benefit from it.
That's a big one there. Did you always have the journalism bug? Where'd that come from?
Again, when you're desperate, you reach for whatever God gave you. And God gave me the ability to communicate and write. And that's how I got the first job. My first big boy job was to work at Congressman Gary Ackerman's office in Queens. And that was, I got the job because I was a college student. I was only 16. They hired a bunch of kids to hand out flyers and sign people up on petitions for the summer. After the primary was over, they got rid of everybody except one kid, and that was me. That's awesome. They kept me because I kind of bullshitted my way into knowing how to do mail merge on computers. But I also could write, I just whatever had the gift. And writing, I keep a typewriter on my desk from 100 years ago, just to remind me that that's the thing that got me to where I am today. And you lean on the skills you have, and that skill just came in my factory settings.
That's amazing. It's kind of funny too. It's kind of a badge of honor. I remember I learned how to type in Brooklyn middle schools on a typewriter. And I always tell my daughter that. I'm like, I learned how to type on a typewriter. And I think that's, side note, completely what's interesting about, my generation, our generation is like that. We bridge that gap, that technology gap. We remember VCRs with wired remotes. We remember when HBO was a little box with a switch on it. But
I'm fascinated though. So just pause on that. Kids are going to have to say the same sentence that you just said about things that we right now seem pretty innovative. I remember we used to use this thing called like Snapchat, where oddly we would take photos of crap and send it to each other in order to communicate. And that was before there were holograms of ourselves.
Exactly.
Living rooms. Like, what's great about life is, that both you and the things around you will be rendered obsolete one day by your successor. I'm always fascinated by that idea.
I'm also fascinated when I say things like that. I really sound like an old man. And more, I sound like my dad. Yeah, my dad jokes come. I say things like my dad. My wife looks at me. She's like, that's something your dad would say. I'm like, okay, that's not a bad thing to happen. I like my dad. He's a good guy. How
you start to accept it too peacefully. You're like, okay, whatever. I'm a curmudgeon. I don't like the way these young kids behave. I hate TikTok, whatever, whatever it is.
So let's talk a little bit about Rudy G. Like, this is the Rudy G before the Four Seasons landscaping. This is the Rudy G before he went off the deep end. Let's remember, Rudy G brought down the freaking mafia. I love watching all those documentaries. Rudy G's a badass back in the day. Take what you want from him, cleaning up New York City and everything. How'd you get involved with Giuliani?
Yeah, I was was a muckraker reporter for this little newspaper called the Queens Tribune, and the Daily News did a big profile on me when I was a kid. And I was talking about how what I did like about the administration is how they believe that that the cumulative effect of small problems is really big problems, right? And if you can attack the small problems, quality of life problems, eventually you can kind of maintain order and improve quality of life. And the theory made total sense. And so I was quoted in an article, and they reached out to me, and I transitioned to working as like I don't know, I probably was like 22. My job was to get up at 4:30 in the morning and put together the media clips into like a packet and then deliver it around City Hall. But
physical packet.
But funny, once again, it was communications and writing that they noticed. And like very early on, like, oh, this kid can write. And I started writing all sorts of things on behalf of the mayor. And then I would leverage that skill to be promoted pretty quickly. If I didn't get what I'd want, I'd quit, and then I'd come back. I quit twice, by the way. Another lesson is just because if I didn't get what I wanted, I would quit and I'd come back.
Interesting. And they take you back. So let's rewind to September 11th, 2001. Where were you physically that morning?
Well, that day was primary day in New York, right? This was the end of the administration. People had more than enough of Rudy. And so I was making my way to wherever the polling site was. And then that's when the entire highway just came alive with sirens. And I made my way to the World Trade Center site. And actually, I was standing underneath the towers after the second plane had hit. And a couple blocks away, I was setting up a press conference. And there was nobody around. Like, there were columns of firefighters rushing towards the building, and everyone else had scrambled. And I'm standing there with a couple of colleagues just trying to set up a presser, unable to reach the mayor, saying, this just makes no sense. Like, because that was always the MO, was to, be present, show up on the scene, let people know that the government's in charge, which that works in typical circumstances. But I literally was standing up thinking, like, I can't even conceive what I'm seeing during those 15, 20 minutes. And I was making my way back to City Hall to try to figure out where the mayor was when the towers collapsed. And so for those few minutes, this big cloud comes down Broadway. I can't really see that it's the fact that the genesis is that the tower has collapsed. All I see is a cloud, and we in the crowd believe that sarin gas is coming our way, or anthrax. You just don't know. And I remember all these rocks and everything just overtake us. I was on the ground, like, retching. Everybody was like retching, thinking like, are we dying at this moment? And then you realized, okay, I don't know what that was. And then you begin to put the pieces together again.
Did you truly think at that moment you were going to die? What was it like? Did you really have that moment? Like, this is the last breath I'm going to take in life?
I had that, that a kind of panic that you don't know what it's like until you experience, like a caged animal, where life is about to be squeezed out of you because you're breathing in this material. And your mind thinks it's gas, right? Because you're under attack. So it's a logical thing to think that cloud
top of mind
is a bomb, and everyone's screaming, and then you're overtaken by it. And but 30 seconds later, you're like, okay, I'm still here. That was debris from the building. I cannot believe that the World Trade Center has just collapsed. And
the thought process, all those things that are just happening right now.
So it's interesting when you're in government. There is a degree of sacrifice where you're like, all right, I'm meant to be on the front line, like get yourself together. And then right away went into trying to figure out where the mayor was, where everyone was. And as I was walking north on Broadway, I was able to contact the mayor's folks who were walking one block over, and we met at a firehouse. And I'll never forget this scene. I walk into the fire station, and all the gear on all the walls is gone. The fire commissioner at the time, Tommy Von Essen, is sitting on the floor, and his hands are in his face, and he's crying. And the mayor is in an office with his chief of staff. They're on the phone with the White House screaming, we need air cover. Because, again, you don't know what's going on.
We didn't know if there's more attacks. Yeah.
You hear fighter jets flying over. And it was just like, what is going on? This is only an hour into it. You're sort of in a fog of war. And then I spent every day of my life, every waking moment for 2 years at Ground Zero, decided I wasn't going to leave until we had a plan. I moved my apartment to the site. I sat right up site. I've got an apartment on the top because I became the employee number 2 or whatever of the new federal agency designed to rebuild the Trade Center site. And I just said, I'm just going to sit right here and walk through that debris and do whatever is necessary until we're back on our feet. I tend to be a little belligerent. So I was like, all right, this is going to be my life now, as long as it takes.
Did you get sick at all? Any lasting health effects, problems?
I don't talk about this a lot because I remember I had a friend of mine, Paula Grant-Berry, who lost her husband at the site. And I watched her raise her 3 little boys without a dad. And a few years after the attacks, I ended up with testicular cancer. And I remember going, and I was only 32 years old. And I remember going to see her. It's so strange. I said, I just want to go for a walk with you to remind myself just how bad life can really be. Like, so I have cancer. I had these extra years that you didn't have with your husband, and your husband never got a chance. So no matter what happens to me going forward, this was literally the day after I was diagnosed, a couple of days. I just wanted to remind myself, like, these years that other people didn't get these years. So don't ever feel sorry for yourself. So
wow.
I still feel that way. Like, hey, whatever happened, I had testicular cancer, I had all sorts of, hormonal issues and stuff like that come from it. But I didn't die that day. And so I'm very sensitive about associating the two, if that makes sense. I feel for anyone who's gone through it. But so I saw when Paula had to raise these beautiful little boys by herself. I'm like, life turned out okay for you.
I appreciate you sharing that with all of us. I really do. And it really just gives perspective. And it was insane. So let's talk about the recovery efforts, which you were, a big part of there. What was it like to be influential on what the future was going to look like? The site, paying homage and proper respect to those who lost their lives and something to leave as a legacy. What was that like?
I mean, the whole thing was just crazy. I mean, in the period right after the attack, think about these different phases I went through. Phase number 1 is recovery and healing, but also bringing every world leader to the site. So
you brought Putin there. You brought Putin there, right?
I brought Putin there. I brought the Emir of Qatar. I brought the president of every single, site. And it was all to build support for the retribution, right? I mean, whether forget about the Iraq war. Remember, we still had Afghanistan.
Yeah, we were in a war. Yeah.
We were to take care of Al Qaeda. So part of the job was to bring everybody, show them just what happened, right? It's very easy to rationalize death and destruction when you're a world leader if you don't see it. But when you take people to see it and you see the carnage, it's hard to resist. And so part of that effort in those first 3 months was building support to use bases. And then it was like we're New Yorkers, right? So it doesn't take long before all the solidarity and the Budweiser commercials that are bringing everybody together fade, wears off, and then suddenly we're fighting. So the mandate was relatively impossible. You had 16 acres that all had to do so much on behalf of the United States. It had to memorialize those we lost. It was also the final resting ground for people who hadn't even been identified yet, right? It also was the heartbeat of the city and a financial capital of the world, where people had a claim to rebuild 10 million square feet of commercial space. So you had all these conflicting impulses, and you had Giuliani on the one hand saying the whole 16 acres should be a memorial. You had a lot of family members who felt the same way. Then you had the responsibility to build a memorial that my little boy, who wasn't born yet, could go to the site one day and have a general sense of what happens. So I spent a lot of time with our team traveling the country, looking at memorials that did stand the test of time and those that didn't.
And which ones inspired you?
Vietnam War, no doubt, memorial, and we put Maya Lin on the jury, actually, because she went through a lot of similar things. It was rejected at first. There was an attempt to actually, that people wanted a literal memorial like a lot of the other memorials had been. But what I found was what we found, and anybody who studies memorials understand, the more literal a memorial is, the more likely it is to be forgotten over time when the next generation comes. And so I think where we ended up
is perfect. The footprint, the reflections, it was
reflections as honestly probably the most proudest project I've ever been associated with, not because of the enormity of it too, but because of the wisdom of the decision. We created a jury and Paula Grant-Berry was actually the family member on the jury. We created a jury of people of the right mindset, ran the largest design competition in history. And we chose a memorial that will preserve the footprint. So when my son walks up there and sees that 1 acre void is where a building that was 100 plus stories, 110 stories, is now gone and receded into the ground, with 3,000 souls lost their lives. That memorial will be emotionally resonant 100 years from now.
Because you can visualize it. You could visualize the space, how much space it took up. It's there. It's a footprint.
But then what I also love about the site, and this is something that then people didn't really grasp, because there were those, this memorial is shameful because it doesn't have a resilient symbol. And then the building, people like the building, they didn't realize that one day it would all read as one composition. So the memorial is then juxtaposed with a 1,776 foot tall tower that told Al Qaeda.
The big middle finger.
Big middle finger, right? Yeah. But what's interesting about that project too is, like, when you were going through it and you were getting your head kicked in, you just had to say, it's not about now. It's about 20 years from now. Like, history will judge this project kindly. Also, your feelings are irrelevant. You are an asterisk on history. This is a service to the city and to the country. So who cares how you feel? And you will never be recognized. The work will never be, you know what I'm saying? Like, it'll stand for itself. And it's also nice to be associated with something like that too, where you can almost suspend you're taking all hits in every direction. Just like, it'll work out over time, and that's okay.
Yeah. And a little footnote there. I was lucky enough. I was working at American Express across the street, 2010, 2011. Okay. My first day working there, 44th floor. I walked all the way over. My desk was looking out the window on top of the World Trade Center site, and my heart dropped because it was the perspective that I got from 44 floors up. The building was about a third of the way done. The footprint was there. They were building it out, and I just lost my breath. And every day I got to watch this, and it was inspiring to me.
Well, what's amazing about the building that you were in, there's I think it's called the Winter Garden, right? Yes. That's where we would do the unveiling of all the plans. There are the palm trees in between.
In the middle, yep.
Oh my God, I would spend all day and night, doing these massive press conferences to roll out the plans. And a lot of it too was keeping people positively oriented that we're making progress. And then there was unrealistic expectations. Like, how is it possible this is going to take, 20 years? It's like, well, unfortunately, that's what it does take, to build all those buildings.
I deeply appreciate this part of the conversation, and I really wasn't imagining going this far, but it's absolutely been incredible. So let's shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about business. Let's talk a little about sports and entrepreneurship there.
A little heavy. Yeah.
I had a terrible transition, but I got to do this as a host. Okay. So wait, quick question though. First, Queens guy, who's your baseball team?
Mets.
Steve Cohen,
yeah.
Is this the legacy for my kids? it was another like redeeming moment of 2020, and the papers got signed. And I have hope as a Mets fan. I have chairs from Shea Stadium sitting in my den. They're my prized possession. I have hope for this franchise.
I mean, I go back to again, growing up poor in Queens. Like, I could sit in those bleacher seats for $5-6. Jose Oquendo, Junior Ortiz, Mike Jorgensen.
There we go.
I could rattle off that team, but I have to say I'm good friends with Jeff Wilpon, and I will, whatever you say about the Wilpons, they really cared and really tried. So it's easy to vilify, but
I'm not saying anything.
No, you're not. I'm just saying to anybody listening, I just think but
there's a lot to the story. There's a lot to the people. They only see the bad news, the schemes, and all the other stuff. So, and we're not going to call them the coupons. I always laugh when I hear that. That's kind of funny too. So, I mean, football. What about well, I know you're a Jets guy.
I grew up with the Jets. I also grew up loving the Dolphins, believe it or not, as a kid, right? Super duper and throwing the ball around, Dan Marino in the early 80s.
So you grew up as a Jets fan, you grew up as a Dolphins fan, and now you're literally sitting on the board of these two companies. What the hell is that like, man? Surreal, right?
It is definitely. I always say I was the accidental sports executive, but remember, my path into sports was actually through development. I mean, the Jets hired me because they wanted somebody who could reconcile all these different issues to help build them their own stadium. So I presided over what can only be described as a war with Cablevision and Madison Square Garden to try to build a stadium on the west side. And when the Olympic
they got close.
It got close. It got right to one vote.
Right with the Olympics, right? It was a whole thing.
Yeah. And then Shelley Silver voted it down. That didn't work out so great over time for him, but we built
look at him now. Where's he behind her? Yep.
I wish nobody ill, but it is what it is. And then we built a new stadium in the Meadowlands. So that's how I got into sports, frankly. But as a kid growing up and working all the time, it wasn't like sports was a huge part of my life. I was just trying to survive, and so I wasn't, a huge sports fan.
Yeah, man. So what, listen, we're going to get into a little entrepreneurship stuff here, but what separates RSC apart from other VC firms?
I think, I just talk about what makes us special. I think is Steve Ross is a builder. At the end of the day, we always says we're not investors. It's like, well, we technically are. We're writing checks, but we both built things. I mean, he's one of the most creative, dynamic entrepreneurs in the country.
I did get to meet him once with Gary during my time.
Yeah, Gary, right. And so I think what's different is my bias is to build, my inclination is to create, and not to passively invest. And I've done it alongside our founders. So in other words, we've incubated businesses from scratch. We have incubated the largest privately owned soccer tournament on earth. It is a complicated, painful, distressing business where I've had to travel the world to help put this together. And we've got an amazing CEO and Danny Silman doing the work. We know how to build. And so people will say that, but there's a difference when you have somebody on your cap table who's a builder and an operator. It's just different than having somebody who's always been an investor, right? So it makes me very empathetic. And I always like to say, if there's a train coming, I'll do my best for both of us to get out of the way. But if not, well, I'll hold your hand. We're going to go down together. And I mean that,
Yeah. Totally. So side note, I mean, I saw a post from you a couple of months ago, how much you miss travel, but on the flip side of that, is it nice to just take a pause?
Oh, so nice. I mean, I don't think we need to pretend. First of all, we have one obligation, is to survive this pandemic and be optimistic and get ourselves together. You know, so to be shamed into being like, it's all bad. Nothing's all bad or all good in life, right? So I didn't realize how much I was agonizingly missing my children. I mean, I know this, but I didn't really know how much it actually affects my emotional health. To be able to have my little boy come up and be like, "Hey, Dad, can I interrupt? I have a question." You know, and my homework, like, it's amazing to be around.
Me anytime you want.
Right, and I am definitely. I find myself playing offense more than I used to play defense more. I'm able to, the rhythm of my day. I get up usually around 4:30, 5 o'clock, and I'm able to establish my priorities as opposed to everyone else establish my priorities. And I've been actually a lot more productive than I've ever been before. Because I only do what matters now. I don't do stuff that's nonsense. You know, it's interesting. There's been like a kind of a culling of the stuff that's irrelevant. The travel I miss just from the serendipity of discovery, but I'm happy to be home.
So quick note, because I got to cover it off. You know, Gary Vee, how did that relationship start?
So Gary Vee, he's a huge Jets fan, as you were aware. And in 2009, I was running the business of the team, or whatever I was doing at that point, but I maybe the sales operation. And one of my sales guys, Jeff Fernandez, Jeff, if you're out there, is like, you know, this guy, Gary's a huge fan. He owns winelibrary.com. He's got the money. He's going to buy a suite. I was like, he's not buying a suite and he doesn't have the money, but he's like, no. So, you know, and I'm like, you know, when you're overseeing a sales operation, like sometimes you got to roll up your sleeves and sort of do the work. So I go out to Springfield, New Jersey to get a bagel with this guy, Gary Vaynerchuk, sitting in this bagel store. And, you know, first 10 minutes, I'm like, this guy's like batshit crazy, like just like all over. And he does not have the money to buy a suite. But in the second 10 minutes, I always say it's like, I started like listening, thinking, you know, when you sort of pull away some of the theatrics, he started making predictions about where the world was going, how by virtue of the smartphone, every human on earth is going to be a combination of Comcast and HBO. They're going to be their own content creators. And as a result, Twitter is just the beginning. These big, you know, companies are like battleship carriers. They won't be able to keep up with the ever-changing landscape, and content has now been democratized. And there's a room for a new agency that'll be social media focused, digital first. And me and my little brother AJ are going to do it. We're going to crush it, whatever. And I'm at the Jets thinking, like this guy Gary could probably make me like the executive who gets it. Like I could tap into the brain. What if we do a deal? And at that bagel store, we cut a deal that if he could take one Jets player and really kind of put him on the map and amplify his presence, and it worked, I would give him 4 Jets tickets to become the first client of VaynerMedia.
I love this story, man.
And then we went to Serenade, I believe, in Summit, New Jersey, with Kerry Rhodes, the safety. And he laid a media plan for Kerry, and the rest is history. And you know, I went back with Steve Ross. We acquired almost 40% of the firm. And now, what I love about life. So here I am in a bagel store. This kid Gary, and it's an important story, by the way, because a lot of other people who met him in my world passed on writing a check because they couldn't get past, you know, maybe some of the bluster or whatever. Like they don't get it. And fast forward in this Super Bowl, which was in Miami, by the way, at the Dolphins, right? Our firm, VaynerMedia, had more Super Bowl ads than any other firm in the country. So, you know, for those of you out there, you got to kind of trust your instincts, especially if you have good instincts around what makes people great, and try to block out the noise of the haters.
I was going to save this question for later, but something that's been resonating with me in my own entrepreneurship journey is an expression I keep hearing is you bet on the jockey and not the horse. Yeah. Is Gary one of your best jockey bets you've had?
Yeah, Gary. Definitely.
I'm not calling you a horse, Gary, or a jockey.
No. It's, you know, it's interesting. I always say, oh, it's a cliche, but things are cliches for a reason, right? Like, in fact,
that's a cliche too. Yeah.
Right. Well, I was going to say, but it's right. I was going to say it's a cliche to talk about cliches, but Gary is a great bet. Also, another kid named Jesse Darris is a young guy backed in PR. We created a PR firm called Darris, probably #1 firm representing direct-to-consumer businesses in the country. Like, I don't know. And what I love about it, like, I think one of the things that have made me very successful in my 20s and 30s, when I was sort of emotionally broken and my mom died the first day Giuliani became press secretary. Like I was very fractured by the time 9/11 happened, and it allowed no room for healing. Right. Like in that phase of my life, I couldn't trust anybody in this world. Like it was all on me to get myself out of poverty. Everyone kind of did let me down, to be honest. Like society didn't step in. We didn't have any healthcare. I sort of was alone with her in the house. My point is, professionally, that's only going to take you so far. If you're a lone wolf, you can only get so far in your own skills, and not everybody's your implement where you just direct them to do what you want. If you really want to create operating leverage out of life and fulfill your wildest dreams, find people who are better than you to draft behind and enjoy the wonder of discovery of saying like, wow, you're better than me. I have more room to grow because there's not a ceiling on my head. And I love meeting people like a Gary, thinking like, wow, you are so self-possessed. It's not an act. You actually love yourself deeply and you have some great gifts. And Jesse was great. So the reason for my success is I transitioned from a lone wolf to somebody who really looked to draft behind other people and submit to their greatness and maybe find something where I could buttress them. Does that make sense? So everyone has a vulnerability, a flank that's left uncovered. If I could buttress them and if I could cover a flank, then I could maybe contribute to their success, but also submit to their greatness. And I love that more than being, great myself, right? I love discovering something better.
I'm going to pause on that because that just sunk in so deep. And thank you for sharing that. Like it just switched something in my mind. So thank you.
Oh, thank you
for sharing that with me today. That really did. I got to ask this last question. What do you dislike the most about working with Gary? What is the biggest thorn in your side? Does he get seasick on that boat, or is he okay on the boat? No, okay.
Great. You know what? It's interesting. This is an unlitigated issue in my head. I'm not sure who's right or wrong. But I find that Gary has we can screw something up royally, and I will agonize as to why. I always want to understand why I get things wrong because it's a little bit like, wait, I thought I had that right. And I will also want to course correct for the next time. So I spend probably a little more energy than necessary auditing. Gary will be like, whatever. I'm glad we got that wrong because something better is going to happen. And so there are times when I'm like, shouldn't we be a little more reflective of like what happened there?
Different approach. It's a different way. That's your yin and yang, right? Isn't that your yin and yang with Gary? Like, isn't that the balance? What makes you two together stronger?
Also, take a step back. Think about it. Kind of makes sense. You have a guy who's putting himself out in front of the entire world, surrounded by haters all the time who want to dismiss him and, it's not authentic, right? If he wasn't built that way, he couldn't be who he was. And by the way, this is how God made me. I am, crazy reflective. My mind is on fire. I cannot stop. I'm always coming up with a new idea. And I unfortunately, I agonized. And I'm hard on myself, right? But it's just what makes me who I am. And so I've learned to admire that about him and recognize that that's what he needs to be and understand this is who I need to be.
Perfect. Amazing. I love it. We're done with Gary. Let's talk Shark Tank for a minute. I got to hit my check marks here. So true entrepreneurship. So we got Cuban, Damon, wonderful, Lori, Barbara, Robert, right? Is there one quality that you could say, the one core quality, despite all their, all their different personality traits and attributes and everything, is there one quality that every single one of them, including yourself, have in spades?
That's a great question. I think a little bit of defiance. Like you can come at them, you can come at me, but you better make sure that blow keeps me down because if not, I'm going to get right back up and come after you really hard. There's a defiance.
It's a queen side of you too, man.
Yeah, it is. But I think you find, look, I would say that you have one job that you wake up with in the morning that you cannot outsource to your mother, to your spouse, and that's to love yourself. It sounds like, gobbledygook, but it's actually really true. Think about it intellectually. If not you, then who? And I find that those have mastered, with even a touch of defiance, the ability to love themselves unquestionably. And that steals them for the journey. So I'd say probably defiance.
Awesome. And what shark do you feel most aligned with from a business investment mindset?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say none of them because they're all running a different play. And I mean, Lori is an incredible inventor who is just like making product, and she's really in the weeds. And I would say probably she's just so deep in there. And Robert Herkovic is this delightful, empathetic, leader. Cuban is a giant, the emperor. It's all. But I enjoy pieces of them all. Damon I hang out with, we go fishing. Kevin O'Leary is living his best life. I'd say
he's a sick guitar player also. He's an amazing guitar player.
Well, the thing I love about Kevin, I admire people who have a well-curated life for their own
wine
that are multidimensional, right? I mean, everybody listening there out there, like take time to curate your life and make it multidimensional because you'll be a lot happier in the end and cultivate those interests. Like I never did until I hit my 40s and I'm still feel like I don't have enough. Kevin is wine and watches and like selling steaks and cooking steaks and making money. And like, and telling it like it is. So I kind of admire the way he's curated his life, and I admire the way he doesn't bullshit, waste people's time. It's kind of amazing. So I take a little bit from everybody.
That's interesting. And you brought up something I really didn't plan on asking, but what's your biggest regret? What's your biggest regret in life?
What is
because I heard something. I heard something in there. Like you said, you hit your 40s and you're talking about O'Leary, what he's done. And like, I mean, is there something that you feel like you missed out on, or you don't look back like that?
I don't have many because I'm pretty intentional. Many huge regrets. The regrets I have are little moments with the children where I got it wrong. Probably like they make me cringe.
You're not learning though as a parent, isn't like
still are enough to bring me to my knees. Like, yeah,
I've had those moments too, man. Right? I got an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old. I've had them recently.
Like, when you fail, like, of course, I went through divorce. So there are moments where I'm like, there's those, but those are probably my biggest regrets. But otherwise, I feel pretty good about the choice I made, and also you do the best you can at a moment in time. Like there wasn't time for hobbies, unfortunately. And like, now I'm like, all right, let me become more multidimensional.
Well, what's your hobbies? What do you like doing?
That's a great question.
Yeah. I like building Legos. I've been a Lego maniac my whole life. I mean, I got to interview the head of Lego Social last week. It was like my favorite interview. It was great. I love Legos and I play with my kids all the time. It's my favorite thing in the world to do for the last 42 years of my life.
I'd say my number one hobby is as I dramatically lower the bar to travel so that I could have little micro vacations sprinkled throughout my entire life all the time. So I'll give you an example. My wife, who's the coolest person in the world and always like, just sure, whatever.
Yeah, it is builder too, right? I've seen her with that power drill on your Instagram.
I had to go to a meeting in Slovenia randomly. And she was like, I never been there. Like, why don't I, meet you? But she's also very frugal. So we're and I forgot to tell anybody this was going to happen. I was only in Slovenia for a day. She flies to Germany overnight so she can spend no money and get a connecting flight and like pay like 200, and then walks into the restaurant in Slovenia and everyone's like, is it Sarah? And I was like, oh, I forgot we're going to have a date night, here. But she was able to get the tickets on like freaking flyer miles. So
you had a date night halfway around the world.
And,
I love it.
And so I would say travels, does that really count as a hobby? Maybe I am too one-dimensional. My hobby is, to be honest, I love putting myself in uncomfortable positions and living in this perpetual growth mindset. When I finished Shark Tank, it was one of the hardest, most uncomfortable things I've done, being on set, whatever. And I remember talking to my wife, like after the first taping was over, half day. And I was like, wow, that was the most uncomfortable thing I think I've ever done. And then I experienced a little bit of melancholy, like, So just to get to the point of that, I always ask myself the following question almost every week. What can I do today that I couldn't do yesterday that brings me closer to tomorrow? When I say I couldn't do it yesterday, I didn't either have the credentials, the experience, the entree to do what I want to do. That always forces me to live in a growth mindset. So as soon as I finished, Shark Tank, I went through a couple of weeks of melancholy. And I was like, I know, I always wanted to teach at the best place. Like I always wanted to be a professor. Like I'm going to go to
Harvard, man.
That would be, yeah. And then, work a year with my co-professor, Len Schlesinger, and now we teach together at Harvard Business School. But that's
awesome.
Is that a hobby? That's a way of life, maybe, I don't know.
I dig it, man.
I'm open-minded. So give me suggestions about what else I should be doing.
Real quick, what's the favorite place you've ever traveled to?
It's a great question. Ireland. I love Ireland.
On my list.
Yeah. I brought my son on my trips with my kids have been so magical, right? So I brought my son to Ireland and we took the red eye and I thought he was sleeping in the back and we were driving through the country and I was looking at this, just thinking like, oh, I cannot believe it. Actually, it looks like I hear this voice in the back and it goes, Daddy, I didn't really think it would look like this. And it was the same time I was having that thought. And so Ireland, I don't usually go to the same place twice a lot, but I go to Ireland a lot. I'm fortunate to travel. I've been to China 4 times. I've been to Australia for 36 hours. I was in Russia last 2 years ago for the World Cup. I've been all over. Ireland is where my heart is.
Have you been to Iceland?
I love Iceland. I fell in love with my wife in Iceland, and we, every year we get remarried for fun. She buys a new dress, online, and we randomly find a place. Last year was Madrid, but Iceland is on the list. But Iceland was our first sort of trip, so I love it.
We did that last year, and I was looking back at the pictures, and I'm like, what? There's no place closer to what another planet looks like. It's amazing.
I was just gonna say, isn't it like you step foot on the moon? You're like, where is it?
It was unbelievable. I mean, it was like you're in glaciers, you're in the middle of nowhere. And for me, it was a moment to breathe. It was last November, almost a year ago. And I remember that was the last time I was able to breathe. I went
to Iceland in November too. That's an interesting time. It's like
gorgeous.
Gorgeous. The sun goes down like 4 or 5. You know, I stayed on a fjord. I don't know how to say that right, but
fjord.
Yeah, Iceland's great. Anybody out there go to Iceland? It's a short flight it's like 5 hours.
Yeah, it's 5 hours, and it's dark. Anyway, we'll get back to that. So the purpose of the show, the core of it, we're going to talk about tenacity for a quick second here when we bring it home. But I want to talk about how you hire. There are a couple of questions that are like Matt Higgins' signature interview questions when you're hiring somebody.
Oh, now they're going to know my signature.
Well, listen, that's how I draw. This is a lead gen question.
Yeah, that's fair. I'd say most of my questions are designed to take a person outside themselves, channel another person, because I find they don't want to. People don't want to lie when they're representing another person's viewpoint. So what do I mean by that? I always ask somebody, "You're not here anymore. Now you're your best friend. I want your best friend to describe your entire all your qualities to me." And I find people they want to represent themselves accurately. They don't want to lie on behalf of their friend. This is really
That's a tricky question.
It is a tricky question. And another question I ask, describe the time in your life professionally when you were at least happy. Take me back to that moment. And I think when you do that, you end up getting a sense of what it takes to motivate somebody. Part of me, I think an interview is a two-way street. I want to de-risk the decision for the other person too. Because if they make the wrong call, I've made the wrong call, right? It's not just me picking the wrong hire. I want to give them as much data as humanly possible. So I want them to understand how I tick. So I need to get first, like, okay, in what situations do you thrive? And what situations you're unhappy? So I could be honest with you and say, oh, that's what I'm like. You're actually about to walk into the wrong situation, or vice versa. So I do a lot of head trippy type, questions, to be honest. They're all cerebral and psychological.
Well, that's what taps into different parts of the brain that a lot of people are used to using in the workplace, but that you need in the workplace. It's really right. That's a big one. And we're going to clip that one up because I think that's really important.
I'll give you one because it's everyone always gets the same answer, so it doesn't matter if I share. I always ask people, if you were to die tomorrow, what's one thing you would regret having not done? I always ask that question. And what's crazy, it's like survey says, remember The Price is Right? Survey says
top 3 answers on the board.
Well, what do you think is the top answer?
Skydiving.
Well, interesting. So not quite skydiving, but travel is the number one.
More travel.
No matter if you are 22 or you are 52, everyone wants to be somewhere else. Which I don't know if that's a longing for escapism or an imagining of a better life, but everyone always says travel.
Experiences, adventure. So let's bring it home here.
Yep.
This show for me. It's going to be episode 113. I've done 113 of these shows. I've done 70 live shows in the last 2 years. This is my masterclass, Matt. I get to talk to amazing experts like yourself. And this is my favorite question. There's a couple more to wrap it up with, but what is the single greatest piece of advice that you've ever received that you take action on every single day of your life?
Oh, I love that. I would say it's be an agent in your own rescue. And I remember actually, when I was sort of lamenting a situation or felt like I was out of control. And he said, this guy, I would say, listen, all right, you got to be an agent in your own rescue. You got to take custody of your life. And I was like, you're right. Right. It just made me think, like, always be at the helm at the end of the day. Never surrender your agency.
And what would you say is your greatest professional accomplishment?
My greatest professional accomplishment, I think it was probably navigating 9/11, post 9/11. Like, that was really hard. I mean, that was the hard.
Interesting. That was 20 years ago. And think about what you've accomplished on paper since then.
Yeah, I think
like financially, like that wasn't a financial not in that sense at all.
That was an impossible mandate that you had to just endure so much. I mean, think about it. Like, I still haven't fully come to terms with the death that I witnessed. I was standing underneath the towers where people are jumping. I can't even comprehend it still to this day. So I think and my mother had just died, to hold it together and work with Kevin Rampey, all these great people that I still feel indebted to. Yeah, that's interesting. You're right it's 20 years later and I've done all these other things, Shark Tank, whatever. Yeah. That may never change. You might ask me that 20 years from now. It might still be the same.
I love it. And, you said recently in an interview, I was watching it with Kind Bar founder Daniel Lubitsky. You said, quote, at 16, you learned every crisis opens up an aperture into a parallel universe where things are being done differently and better, and get excited. So with that being said, Matt, please share with us one personal silver lining and one professional silver lining that you've experienced over the last 8 months, 9 months during the pandemic.
Well, the personal silver lining has, I would never give up these months around my children, for anything. So the ability to, I think a lot of parents probably struggle with this, man or woman, with the choices you have to make to try to balance the pressure you have professionally. And, if you were blessed enough to have an office job where you had the freedom to now work from home, and I know a lot of people don't. I think about those people all the time, because I imagine if this had happened 20 years ago and I was still taking care of my mom, how desperate I would be to be on the front line. But to be blessed enough to be home, that you were finally given permission to be all in on your family while proving that you could still juggle your job. Like, that never would have happened unless this happened. And as a result, we're never going back fully to the way it was before. We're never going to completely compromise all of our personal values, because we don't need to. So I'd say that was number one. And then professionally, all the friction that was gratuitous, unnecessary, that we just submitted to because everyone submitted to it, the friction of, like, why do I have to travel across the country to go do a deal with you when I could do it on Zoom? Like, why does my entire workforce need to work in the same location when I could assemble great people like virtually? Like, the massive amounts of friction have been eliminated from the system. I think the next 10 years are going to be the greatest period of innovation that we have ever experienced in our lifetime. And I don't know what the corollary, but it's like a combination of the roaring 20s and the booming internet of the late 90s. Like, because the bar to starting a business has been dramatically lowered. None of us are going to say, okay, I'll go back on a plane again and do work travel that has no point. Like, it's going to have to be really, really accretive to, get back on the train. Like, so I mean, a plane rather. So everything becomes that much more efficient. And so I think this is going to be a spectacular period of innovation and growth.
I love it. I love that perspective. And last but not least, taking it back to those tough days of your childhood in Queens, single parent, your mother's sick, 9/11, she passes, you got to step up. You got to reach down deep inside and harness that inner tenacity that you have in spades, man. And you grow and you build and you have these incredible career and life journey and the ups and downs that it takes, right? And looking back, and you want to show gratitude and thankful for everything that you do. Matt Higgins, what is your North Star? What is your compass?
So I'm glad you set it up, that going back to that day when I was 16, I witnessed up close powerlessness, and what happens when you are powerless to change your circumstances, and you are so desperate, you are sick, you're trying to raise kids, you have no money, you have no health care, and you slowly do everything you can to try to fight out of that, but it's just quicksand and you're sinking and you die. I watched my parent go through that journey, and I learned the hard way the power of intervention, that if somebody had just sort of reached in when I was a 9-year-old kid and 15-year-old kid, and how would it change the trajectory of her life? And a person who had a lot to offer the universe, who was incredibly smart, would have been able to make a contribution. So the highest and best use of your time and energy and money after you take care of your basic needs is to ameliorate suffering of another. And so that is my North Star. It's not like I want to save humanity, but when I get excited, I imagine, me further down the road where it's being redistributed. And when I say it, I don't know what it is: power, influence, money, empathy. Because think about all the desperate people out there and what an impact it would make if you would just reach into their life. And so I just try not to stray too far from that little moment, even though it's very painful to think about, but it's so also, I feel like I glimpsed what it's all about, if that makes sense. And so I'm always trying to go back to that place. That's my North Star.
Wow. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning, and everyone listening. I really, truly hope that let this episode sink in. There's gold in them mountains, and you got to dig it out. It's all there for you. Matt, where could folks find you? Where could they connect with you? Where could they learn more?
Thank you, by the way. Thank you for bringing it out. You have a nice, tender, sweet way about you. Just want to give you a big hug right now.
Thank you. That's the first time anyone's ever said that after a show. I appreciate that.
You had a sweet way about you, and you deserve only good things.
Thank you.
I spent a lot of time on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn, Matt Higgins, and less time on Instagram, just because I just like the engagement on LinkedIn. So find me there.
That's awesome. And everyone joining us today, remember, you know where to find us. thepodcast.com, all the social media channels. Remember, take care of each other, wash your hands, stay 6 feet apart, and catch us next week for another great episode of the podcast.
Wisdom is forever, but for us, it's time to go. Thank you for joining us. Luckily, we'll be back with our next episode soon, jam-packed with more incredible humans. Thank you for listening, subscribing, and sharing. To join the conversation, search the podcast on LinkedIn. And to catch up on past episodes and more info, please visit www.thepodcast.com.